The boy had never shed a single tear, not even when everyone he loved walked away. But he cried on the day an old wild horse approached, rested its head against his chest, and took its final breath in his arms. There were no reins, no whip, no final whinny. Just a cold, haunting silence, and a moment that buried the boy's entire world, only to kindle a fragile spark in the ashes, an eternal friendship between two souls once forgotten by the world. Come, let us listen to this story. For this is not just a tale about a boy and a wild horse. It is proof that sometimes, relationships don't need words, only presence and a deep understanding, from heart to heart. Every morning in the Utah Highlands begins with a slice of sunlight, cold, golden, and hard as if carved from stone. This is not a land for the fragile. Wrapped in morning mist and soil stiff like bone, this is the kingdom of the wind, where nature writes the rules, and time is measured by survival. There, atop a barren ridge, a creature stands still, like a statue the world forgot. Snow dust clings to his hooves. His mane, great and brittle, sways like ashes in the wind. His eyes, clouded and hollow, seem to carry everything he's seen, and nothing that could surprise him anymore. His name is Ashwind. It means the wind from the ashes. And it fits. Once, he was the fire at the heart of a wild Mustang herd, running valleys and storms, flying down slopes like thunder. But those memories are all that's left. The herd is gone, some captured, some broken, some dead beneath the trees. Ashwind is the last shadow still walking. But surviving doesn't mean living. No one sees him now. No one remembers him. Yet every evening, as the sun dips behind the pines and the shadows stretch across the earth, Ashwind returns to the same ridge. And he stands there. Not for anyone. Not for anything. But simply to say, I was here. Rayden was 14, living on the edge of a dusty town where every road led to the mountains and every dream vanished in red dust. He had grown used to silence, the silence in his father's eyes, in the cold kitchen, in the questions that never found answers. 3 years ago, his mother died in a sudden, senseless car crash, no goodbyes, no warnings. Since then, his father had slowly drowned in liquor and guilt too heavy for words. Rayden was left in the gap between two worlds, the one he used to know, full of light, laughter, the smell of apple pie, and the one he now survived in, where everything turned gray. At school, he was isolated. Not because he was strange, but because his sadness was so quiet, it made others uncomfortable. No one knew what to say to a boy who never looked up. No one wanted to speak to a pair of eyes that never answered. Only one place made Rayden feel like himself, the page. He drew horses. Not fairy tale horses or textbook stallions. Wild ones, dirty, fierce, free, and utterly alone. They weren't tamed, weren't named, and didn't need anyone's love to keep breathing. But Rayden understood them. Because he was the same. Each sketch was a broken piece of him, put back in place. Each wild eye he shaded was a way to keep his heart from collapsing. And though he never said it out loud, on his loneliest nights, Rayden whispered one quiet wish. If someone out there can still hear me, please, send a sign. Let me know I haven't disappeared completely. That afternoon, Rayden didn't leave home because he was angry. He left because if he didn't, he would fall apart. His father was drunk again. The sound of a bottle breaking. Slurred words spilling like garbage. Then a slap, not hard, but enough to snap the last thread holding Rayden together. He grabbed his coat, slipped his sketchbook into his pocket, and stepped through the door like someone crossing into another dimension. No destination. No map. Just a boy walking away from the only place his heart could no longer stay. He passed the old hills, where dry grass cracked under worn-out saws. Through pale pine woods, where once, long ago, He and his mother had picked pine cones to hang for Christmas. Cold air crept into his collar, his sleeves, his chest. But he didn't feel pain. Pain was something he had already run out of. As the sun sank lower than the horizon, and the sky turned into a bruise of purple and old blood, he stopped. At the top of a hill, littered with gravel. His heart beat slowly, not from exhaustion, but because, for the first time in forever, he wasn't afraid. And then, Ashwind appeared. He didn't approach. Didn't run. He was just there. Standing at a distance, close enough to see his eyes, far enough not to break the sacred space between them. His gaze was clouded, sunken, full of wind and ash. But in that moment, it was the only gaze in Rayden's life that met him without pity, without judgment, without fear. Rayden said nothing. He didn't cry. He slowly sat down on the cold earth, pulled out his sketchbook, set it on his knees, and didn't draw. He just sat there, as if simply being, side by side with that creature, was enough. Time passed like an underground stream, not rushing, not loud, just present. When Rayden finally stood, he looked back one last time. Ashwind still stood there. Still. Silent. But his ears twitched, as if he heard something. Maybe the wind. Maybe the boy's heartbeat. Maybe something bigger than both. Then they turned and walked away. Each in a different direction. No words. No glance back. But Rayden's steps, that evening, felt less lost than ever before. Because for the first time, someone hadn't turned their back on him. Rayden came back to the hill the next day. Not out of curiosity, but because a part of him couldn't stay away. He couldn't draw. He couldn't breathe right until he knew whether that creature, Ashwind, had been real. He brought nothing but a heavier coat, a wooden pencil, and his sketchbook. No hay. No treats. No tricks. He simply sat, in the same spot as before. And waited. Ashwind didn't appear right away. But as the afternoon light shifted from gold to pale blue, Rayden heard hoofbeats. Not hurried. Not panicked. Just steady. Like the heartbeat of something that hadn't given up yet. Then Ashwind stepped into view. Not cautiously, not reluctantly, but calmly. He looked at Rayden, tilted his head slightly, and stood. Closer than the day before. The next day, the distance shrank again. And again. Until one afternoon, Ashwind stood close enough for Rayden to hear his breath, uneven but real. The breath of a creature that had seen the end, and stayed anyway. Rayden didn't reach out. He didn't try to rush things. He understood, the real things take time. You can't force trust, just like you can't force healing. And Ashwind, much like Rayden himself, needed a reason to believe again. There were afternoons where neither moved. No words. No gestures. Just wind and presence. But what passed between them, a glance, a sigh, a new line added to a sketch, carried the weight of 1,000 conversations. Rayden eventually began to speak, not to Ashwind, really, but to the space they shared. I don't think I belong with people either, he whispered once. Ashwind didn't move. But one ear turned in his direction. No one listens to what I want to say. They call me weak. Still no answer. But Ashwind took a half step closer. Not much. But enough. Rayden understood. Connection didn't need language. It needed patience, presence, and the courage to let silence hold meaning. One day, Ashwind lay down near him, not because he was tired, but because he felt safe. Rayden, sitting just a few feet away, watched in quiet awe. This wild thing, once untouchable, had chosen to rest. Friendship, it turned out, didn't always require a hand. Sometimes, all it took was a soul recognizing another soul. Spring came early, and with the new grass came new threats. Trucks began appearing near the base of the hills, loud, unfamiliar, and carrying the scent of danger. A group of men, armed with tranquilizer guns, ropes, and tracking gear, had started searching for wild Mustangs. They didn't care which horse. Age, history, soul, none of it mattered. All they saw was money. Rayden first saw them from a distance, and his stomach dropped. He crouched low behind brush, watching as they laid traps along trails Ashwind often walked. And in that moment, the silence that had once comforted him suddenly felt like betrayal. He realized something: sketching wasn't enough. Sitting quietly was no longer enough. If he wanted to protect something he loved, especially something that couldn't protect itself, he had to act. That night, Rayden didn't go home. He built a small hideout behind a thicket, near where Ashwind usually slept. He scattered human scent near the paths, moved rocks to cover snares, and dragged branches to confuse the hunter's tracks. No one had taught him this. He just did it. With instinct. With fear. With friendship. Ashwind didn't say thank you. But he stood beside Rayden that night. Silent. Steady. And under a sky full of stars, the boy who had spent his life unheard whispered, "This time, I'm not running." The next morning, sunlight crept through the peaks, and Rayden woke with a strange lightness in his chest, like something heavy had finally lifted. But then, the sound of engines and shouting shattered the peace. He crawled to the ridge and looked down. The Mustang hunters had returned. Not just 2, 5 of them. They moved in a sweeping arc. One man carried a tranquilizer gun, already loaded. Rayden didn't need to guess, they were following his tracks. His heart pounded. He turned to look for Ashwind, but the horse wasn't near the shelter. He'd gone down to the open plains, where the sun spilled freely and hiding places were scarce. Rayden had to decide. Run? Go home? Call someone? No, he knew. If he did nothing, Ashwind would be taken. So he ran. Through brush, over splintered fences, across fields still damp with dew. His breath came fast, loud, frantic. From a distance, he saw Ashwind, standing alone in the grass, facing him. Calm. Waiting. Behind him, tires, shouts, the metallic click of a trigger. Run! Rayden screamed. But his voice scattered in the wind. He waved his arms. Ashwind! Run! Ashwind didn't move. And then, a sharp crack split the air. Rayden turned. A dart flew across the meadow, straight toward the horse. Without thinking, he threw himself into its path. The dart grazed his shoulder, tearing skin but not embedding. Pain lanced through him. He gritted his teeth, looked up. Ashwind was moving, not galloping, but walking. Toward him. Voices shouted. Another gun raised. Rayden forced himself up, stood tall between Ashwind and the hunters, arms spread wide. Stop, he shouted. You can't take him. He's wild, kid. He doesn't belong to anyone. But he doesn't belong to you either. Something shifted. Not the earth. Not the sky. Something in their eyes. One lowered his gun. Another shook his head. And slowly, reluctantly, they turned and walked away. Rayden stood, shaking, breath ragged. Ashwind reached him, pressed his nose gently to the boy's forehead. Tears spilled, unchecked, unashamed. No words were spoken. None were needed. They had chosen each other. Time passed like wind, soft, steady, unstoppable. Rayden still came to the hill each day. But he wasn't the same boy. He watched more. Guarded more. Prepared for the next time danger might come. Ashwind stayed near, sometimes gone for a day or two, always returning. Their bond no longer needed building. It simply was. But seasons changed. The sky grayed. The wind chilled. Mornings came slower. Ashwind rose later. His steps sometimes stumbled. Rayden noticed. And he knew. Ashwind was old, not just in body, but in soul. He moved like a warrior who had outlived his war. One afternoon, Ashwind lay down, not from pain, but peace. Rayden sat beside him, arms around the horse's neck. "I know," he whispered. "You stayed for me. But if you're tired, it's okay to go. I won't hold you back. And I promise, I'll make sure they remember." Ashwind didn't answer. He took one long breath, then another. Then none. Rayden sat there for hours. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stayed, letting the wind carry what it needed to take. The next morning, Rayden dug a grave beneath the pine where they used to sit. He laid Ashwind on his side, as if in sleep. Beside him, he placed the first sketch he ever drew of the horse, and a short piece of rope that had never been used. On a wooden plank, he carved, "Ashwind, wind from the ashes, never tamed, never abandoned." Weeks later, Rayden shared the story with a local wildlife group. Then a small column in the town paper. Then a school assembly. Then an art exhibit of forgotten horses. The story spread, not because it was tragic, but because it was true. As true as Ashwind's eyes. As true as that first moment. As true as a farewell that needed no tears to be eternal. And one spring morning, when the wind danced across the hilltop, a herd of wild horses appeared. No one led them. No one knew why. They stood quietly at Ashwind's grave. Then, they moved on. But Rayden knew. A part of Ashwind had returned on the wind. That night, the cold felt different. The wind howled like knives slicing through pine, and snow fell thick enough to erase all footprints. Rayden curled up inside his makeshift tent, damp coat pulled tight, fire nearly gone. He was used to solitude, to cold, to wilderness, but that night, something was off. As if the wind itself was carrying a distant, desperate message. Ashwind didn't appear at dusk like he always did. Rayden waited. An hour. Then 2. Then 3. The wind howled louder. He stood up and followed the familiar trail, his boots sinking deep into the snow, heart pounding with growing dread. And then he saw it, a steel holding pen hastily built near the ravine, floodlights slicing through the storm. Inside, Ashwind thrashed against metal bars, his hooves bloody from kicking. A man stood nearby, tall, wearing a worn leather coat, half his face covered with a scarf. But Rayden knew him instantly. Clint Rowe. A notorious Mustang hunter who had been accused of cruelty but never convicted. Clint was grinning, a dry, wicked grin, like brushfire in the dead of winter. "Old, yeah, but wild still sells," he muttered. "The rich love a good story, the more broken, the better." Rayden clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to charge, to destroy everything. But he knew, one wrong move, and Ashwind could be gone for good. So he stepped back. Into the shadows. And waited. Back at his shelter, Rayden tore through his supplies. He needed noise. Fire. Light. A distraction. Something to draw them away. At the bottom of a metal box once belonging to his mother's old rescue team, he found it, a rusted emergency flare. Possibly still working. He strapped it to his belt, pulled the scarf tighter, and headed out. The storm raged harder now. Clint and two assistants huddled near a campfire, their guard lowered. Rayden lit the flare. With a sharp crack and burst of red light, the night exploded. "Hey!" one man yelled. They turned, just in time to see Rayden sprint into the forest. "There's someone here!" They gave chase. Rayden led them through the woods, where he knew every branch, every split in the trail. His lungs burned. His shoulder ached. But he kept running. Behind him, footsteps thudded closer. Gunshots echoed. He dove into a snowbank, heart pounding. While Clint and his crew scrambled to find him, Ashwind struck. With a sudden, furious lunge, he shattered the makeshift cage. Bloody but free, he vanished into the storm, wild again. Rayden returned to the cage moments later. It was empty, save for scattered hay and hoof prints fading fast in the snow. No sign of Ashwind. Then the cold struck him. The fire was gone. His body trembled. His hands were numb. And with each step, the dark closed in. Then, he collapsed. Between waking and dreaming, Rayden heard hoofbeats. At first faint. Then nearer. Then real. Warm breath brushed against his cheek. A soft, low exhale. Ashwind. He hadn't left. Somehow, he'd returned. Rayden didn't remember how he got back on Ashwind's back. Only that he clung to the horse's neck, his face pressed to a body warmer than the fire ever was. Ashwind carried him over hills, through white silence, past trees bent from years of storms. Until a cabin appeared. The old wooden shack his mother once took him to, back when snow meant holidays, not survival. The roof still held. Inside, a scarf, once hers. A photo on the wall, the three of them, smiling by a fire that had long gone out. Ashwind knelt, letting Rayden slide to the cabin's threshold. Then he lay down just outside, facing the wind. Guarding. Rayden wrapped the scarf around his neck, pulled the photo close, and breathed in a mix of smoke, salt, and memory. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, he knew. This horse wasn't just a creature. He was memory. He was gratitude. He was instinct, wild and ancient. And from that night on, Ashwind was no longer the wind from ashes. He was the warmth left behind, the kind even snow could never bury. The next morning, Rayden woke to the soft chirping of birds on the cabin's weathered roof. Beside him, Ashwind still lay curled, his head resting gently on his front legs, eyes closed, as if guarding a dream only he could see. Rayden sat up and wrapped his mother's old scarf around his neck. His chest ached, but it was a warm ache, the kind that comes when something lost begins to feel like home again. Not because of walls or roofs, but because of presence. He built a small fire just outside the cabin's porch. The orange glow flickered and spread warmth, calling forth memories. Evenings by the fireplace when his mother told fairy tales, his father, once whole, strummed a mandolin. Back when they were a family, unbroken. Rayden pulled a battered sketchbook from his coat pocket, worn edges, torn corners, but a soul that had stayed intact. He turned to a blank page and began to draw. No drafts. No hesitation. Just letting his hand follow his heart. When Ashwind opened his eyes, he saw himself on the page, thinner, older, scarred, but with light in his eyes. A light he hadn't known was still there. Rayden smiled. A real smile. Maybe the first in years. And he understood, some wounds never fully heal. But we keep going. Because someone came back for us, even when they didn't have to. 4 days later, Clint Rowe was arrested. A team of rangers found evidence, the iron cage, the tranquilizers, the illegal hunting tools. An investigation was launched. But for Rayden, justice meant more than names in a report. He had done what he once believed was impossible. A month later, Rayden returned to the old hill, the place where he first met Ashwind. In his hands, he carried a new wooden sign, carved with quiet care, where Ashwind chose to stay. Beneath it, he tied his mother's scarf, weathered but soft, and pinned one of his drawings, a portrait of Ashwind, with shaky words scribbled underneath. The one who came back, when no one else did. News of Rayden's story spread far and wide. A Mustang preservation group asked him to serve as their youth ambassador. He was invited to schools, to conferences, to ranches, not to lecture, but to share. Not with lessons, but with truth. Ashwind no longer followed him from place to place. But he still lived, in drawings, in dreams, in every gust of wind across the red earth. And each time the wind blew, Rayden lifted his head, as if listening. And if you asked, how had that boy changed? The answer is simple. He didn't feel alone anymore. Because now, he knew, some friendships, even just once, are enough to save a life. Spring arrived like a promise kept, soft, gentle, and wrapped in the bright green of fresh grass. The first rays of sunlight pierced the early mist, sparkling across every dew-covered leaf. Yet in the midst of this new life, Ashwind grew quieter than ever. He no longer galloped through the fields like wind itself. No longer raised his head proudly at every distant sound. His steps slowed. He rested more. His coat had turned a duller shade of ash, his once thick mane now sparse. His eyes, once full of fire, seemed to drift toward a place far beyond the present. Rayden saw it all. He brought more fresh grass. He offered sweet apples. But Ashwind only ate a little. He wasn't starving. He wasn't weak. He was ready. And Rayden understood, this wasn't an illness. It wasn't a passing cold wind. It was time. That one thing no being, no matter how wild or strong, could outrun. But Ashwind didn't complain. He didn't moan. He didn't try to hide. He simply paused, more often. Looked up, longer. And Rayden, though his heart felt like it was clenched in a fist, still smiled, still stayed. Because he knew, if someone once came back for you, you stay until the very end for them. One afternoon, with the breeze dancing across golden fields, Ashwind led Rayden back to the hill, the place where two lost souls had first met in silence. No words were needed. But Rayden knew. Ashwind lay down, slowly, deliberately, as if every movement carried the weight of meaning. His legs folded neatly beneath him. His head sank into the sun-warmed grass. Rayden sat beside him, his hand resting gently on the horse's shoulder, not to hold him back, but to go with him. You know, Rayden whispered, this was the first place I ever felt seen. Ashwind let out a long breath, not labored, not pained. Just peaceful. I'll tell your story, Rayden continued, eyes brimming but voice steady. So no one forgets you. So no one forgets that look in your eyes, that first time. The wind passed through the field, carrying the scent of spring grass and wildflowers. And in that moment, the world seemed to pause, just long enough to hear a promise. Ashwind passed in the earliest light of morning, while the fog still blanketed the hills and sunlight barely kissed the treetops. Rayden awoke to a strange chill, not from the weather, but from the silence beside him. He turned. Ashwind lay there, eyes closed, in the same peaceful position he always slept in. But his chest no longer rose and fell. Rayden didn't scream. Didn't shout. He knelt beside him, placed a hand on the stallion's brow, and whispered, So, you've returned to the wind, huh? And then something strange happened. From the far side of the hill, a small herd of foals, young, unsure, their legs still wobbly, ran across the ridge. They didn't panic. They didn't change course. It was as if they were saying goodbye. Rayden buried Ashwind beneath the old tree by the hillside, the place where, for the first time, he had felt truly seen. He dug the grave with his own hands, slow, steady, and without rushing. When it was done, he took out the braided main rope he had once prepared, but never used, because Ashwind had never been tamed. He tied it to the nearest branch. A symbol of freedom, of friendship without control, of a soul who had lived and loved in its own way. The wind stirred. The rope fluttered gently, like a wave. And Rayden, no longer just a boy, stood silent. Not crying. Not speaking. Because he knew something had ended. And something else had just begun. Time moved on. Rayden grew up, no longer the silent boy on the hillside, but a man carrying a story he could never forget. He became an artist, and later, a storyteller, not with eloquent words, but with images drawn straight from the heart. Rayden's paintings weren't just about colors. They were memories, Ashwind's eyes, the golden hill, the unused main rope, and the shadow of a boy who once sat quietly in the tall grass. He traveled everywhere, to schools, museums, conferences, and wild horse rescue centers. In every place, he shared the silent journey between himself and a horse who was never tamed. And in every room, something always shifted. Silence fell. No one spoke. No one laughed. Just glistening eyes, hands held a little tighter, and hearts beginning to reopen. One day, during a school visit, Rayden noticed a little girl crying. Not from sadness, but because she realized, if a wild horse once chose to come back for a lonely boy, maybe someone would come back for her too. After the talk, she gave him a crumpled drawing, a horse on a hill beside a small figure. At the bottom, she'd written just 2 words, "Thank you." Rayden kept that drawing with him, always. One crisp autumn afternoon at a western rescue ranch, Rayden was invited to paint for a conservation campaign. As he passed the row of full pens, something made him stop. A small gray foal stood alone in the corner. It didn't whinny, didn't run, but it looked straight at him for a long time, with eyes so deep it almost hurt. Those eyes were Ashwind's. Rayden stepped closer. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He simply stood still, just like he had years ago on that very first day on the hill. And then, the foal took one small step toward him. Quiet. Trusting. Asking nothing. The caretaker said his name was Dust Whisper, the Whisper of Dust. He'd been rescued from the northern ridges, abandoned shortly after birth. Rayden never tried to tame him. Never brought a rope. But the next day, he came back. And Dust Whisper was still there, waiting. One afternoon, as Rayden sketched near the pen, Dust Whisper quietly approached, lowered his head, and gently rested it on Rayden's shoulder. In that moment, tears welled in Rayden's eyes, not from sorrow, but from something inside finally healing. Ashwind hadn't returned. But what Ashwind had left behind had lived on in its own quiet way. Months later, Rayden returned to the old hill. The wind still blew. The grass still whispered. And the sky opened wide, just like it used to. On the branch beside Ashwind's resting place, the old braided rope still hung. Weathered by sun and wind, but never fallen. Rayden carried a new drawing, Ashwind standing in the wind, beside a young foal with eyes like glowing embers. Beneath it, he had written, "No one truly disappears, as long as someone remembers." He didn't bring a stone. He didn't place flowers. He just sat down, leaned back against the familiar tree, and listened. The breeze brushed his shoulder, old, soft, familiar. And then he whispered, Not every friendship lasts a lifetime, but the ones that reach your soul never truly die. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Tell us about your own story, about a friendship, a memory, or a creature that once made you feel seen and heard. One like, one share. It could mean more than you'll ever know. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory, where stories of life, loss, and wild-hearted friendships will always find their way home. Because somewhere out there, maybe another Ashwind is still waiting. Waiting for someone to sit beside them, just once.